Hi everybody, I'm Ruth Allen, Chief Executive of BASW, and welcome to my weekly vlog. Throughout June, I'm recording conversations with people from different parts of social work on different key topics to mark BASW's 50th birthday, which is this month. Today, I'm discussing social work and BASW's role in tackling inequality, injustice, and specifically racism against Black and minority ethnic people in our practice and in society, how well we do this, and where we need to go to next. I'm going to be joined today by Narinder, Sidhu and Harry Sewell, who will be talking about the work they're doing to help BASW become even more inclusive through their work on the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Group and through their role on Council. We want to make sure that as an association we reflect, support and include the whole diversity of the workforce and that we are a potential professional home for all social workers. But this is also a particularly poignant moment to do this for two reasons. We're dealing with the tragedies of COVID deaths overall, but this includes significant overrepresentation of Black and minority ethnic people in the death toll, and it exposes deep structural inequalities in society. And we are also reacting to the terrible racist murder of George Floyd by a police officer in the US, and the outpouring of anger and demands for change there and here. Both of these add to the urgency of exploring how we as social workers and as an association can make even more of a difference. I hope you find the discussion useful. So I'm delighted now to introduce Narinder and Harry. Hello, Narinder.
Hi, Ruth. So I'm Narinder Sidhu. I'm a lecturer at the University of Derby and an NHS social worker. I'm a council member on BASW and recently was appointed chair of our BASW Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Group. Thanks.
Thanks. And Harry?
Hi, so I'm Harry Sewell. I'm director of a management and training consultancy called HS Consultancy. I'm an author, and my specialist kind of areas around issues of equality and social justice, largely in mental health, but also in social care and actually in society generally. And my background is as a public sector strategic manager, having worked as an executive director in a mental health trust and worked in the Department of Health and other cross-boundary type roles across the NHS and social care.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for joining me today. We're going to be exploring and reflecting on the changing approaches that we've seen to inequality, racism and discrimination, and the challenges of that which have been totally persistent and which are absolutely flared up and brought to our attention really strongly by the current situation. And to look at the approach of public services over the last 50 years, and of course particularly we're talking about social work. So how social work has both been a part of discrimination, part of the challenge of racism and inequalities, but also what we've been doing to tackle that and what we need to be doing to tackle that more in the future. Just to put it in a bit of context in terms of our 50 years, I just want to read a brief quote, which is a definition of anti-oppressive practice from 1994, which is more or less kind of in the middle of our 50 years since BASW was created, since generic social work was created, from Lena Dominelli, who has done an awful lot of work around promoting anti-oppressive practice and was a kind of forerunner in that field. And she talks about anti-oppressive practice as being a form of social work practice which addresses social divisions and structural inequalities in the work that's done with people, whether they're users of services or workers, interestingly, both. Anti-oppressive practice aims to provide more appropriate and sensitive services for people regardless of their social status, embodies a person-centred philosophy and egalitarian value system concerned with reducing the harmful effects of structural inequalities upon people's lives, a methodology focusing on both process and outcome, and a way of structuring relationships between individuals that aim to empower people using services, reducing the negative effects of social hierarchies in the interactions between them and the people providing services. So we're right in the middle of it, right in the middle of those 50 years. That's what we were saying social work was all about, and for a long time this was a really an important approach, and things have moved on, and I think we're going to explore what's happened, how successful was that, and how are we tackling things now. So I'm going to come to quite a general question now for you to think about, Narinder and Harry, and to reflect on what's happening in the world right now with COVID, the inequalities we're seeing there, with the protests around George Floyd's terrible and criminal death. And how do you see these issues relating to social work at the moment? Harry, do you want to start on that?
Yeah, sure. I guess I just want to start by acknowledging that, you know, you've got a series of concentric circles starting with the family, where there's loss and pain, and then the community and the kind of global community. And I just kind of really want to acknowledge that. So as I kind of talk in a way that might seem theoretical, I know that there are human beings who are feeling pain, hurt, anger in there. So where are we? One of the things that the George Floyd killing and also the exposing of the equalities around COVID-19 has done is to make central this idea that people are experiencing the world very differently depending on how you've been racialized, and that people's perceptions of what's happening will be influenced by the extent to which you've been negatively racialized, as well as issues such as class and privilege. And what we're seeing is the fact, for example, with COVID-19, that people will describe a set of experiences such as lockdown without real acknowledgement of the variations of experience. So, you know, if, for example, you're wealthy and you've got the ability to stockpile, or if you've got the ability to, you know, be in your garden and work from home, it's a really different experience than someone who isn't afforded those privileges. And I think we kind of grew into that awareness as a community in the UK, but it wasn't the starting point. And the same is kind of true of what happened with the George Floyd killing, is that, you know, people initially were outraged by the savagery. But then after that, there were questions about, well, what might an appropriate response be? Or, you know, why are people in the UK being so upset and jumping on the bandwagon? And then out of that initial kind of, you know, coalescence around a similar view of it came these separate perspectives. And I think in some ways that really reflects some of the kind of history of what's happened in social work, whereby, you know, there's a kind of superficial acknowledgement almost by everyone that we believe in fairness and that no one should be treated differently. But then once you get beyond that, you discover that in practice, some of people's internalized prejudices, some of the unconscious biases that have arisen through the reinforcement of negative stereotypes means that, for example, the way in which we assess risk, depending on who's presenting, has been different, and there's been evidence to suggest that is the case around childcare or around adult mental health, just as one example. Or the empathy which is shown has kind of varied depending on who's in front of the practitioner working at the time. And at that level, you've seen interpersonal differences because people might articulate a value that doesn't show up in their practice. But we've also seen the reinforcement of these things in some of the kind of policies and structures. You know, so just to kind of conclude this, the kind of debates around, you know, placing children and the merits or otherwise of placing children who have been racialized as being Black in white families, and that kind of debate I don't think is really resolved because people take you know, different sides on that, and beneath the positions that people take are a whole set of assumptions and values and perhaps, you know, educations that informs that. And I don't think we've managed to really tease that out in a deep way in practice. In theory, that informs our practice, so it shows up in what social workers and social workers as a profession does over time.
Yeah, thanks, Harry. Narinder, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, that was a really comprehensive. I have to agree with Harry. I think for me, a key aspect in all of this is, I think we've had local communities doing and actually supporting work that social workers do. And I think local communities have actually become a lot more aware of the structural barriers and a lot more aware of the racism. Now, if you look at how the COVID situation was going, it was actually due to individuals, not just social workers, but actually just part of the public, thinking, hang on a minute, in the news, so many individuals from certain groups of people are actually at more risk of death from COVID, but also there's a common factor there, there's a theme. Certain groups of people have been in the media that have died from COVID, and people have started to ask these questions and have these discussions. And I think that is, for me, when I started to look into that, what I realised is that it's actually something that the structural barriers in the government and all the policies that we have that prevents people from actually having open access and transparency. And it isn't until we start to ask questions, why is this happening? I mean, why were we having to ask and lobby for a public inquiry into what is the situation of COVID now, and also the transparency of all the statistics and so on. Then we've got the media saying that certain classes of communities are at risk because of they're at more risk of those health inequalities, social inequalities. It's their housing, they're overcrowded and all of these. But then we're at the stage now, that was a conversation we were having some time ago, but now we're having, and I would hope we're having the conversation of actually, why is that? Why is it that these inequalities, why is it that certain groups of individuals have poor access to education about COVID for a start, but also have poor access to health access? Men, for instance, sometimes they're not open to going to the doctor when they've got a certain problem, whereas women are more so able to do that. So there's lots of key elements that form actually the whole picture that's been highlighted. And in regards to George Floyd, those harrowing images that we've all seen, that would be something that would happily happen in the USA, and no one really, maybe there have been times where there's been a massive delay, but it was filmed, everybody saw it, and for someone to watch those harrowing images and actually not feel themselves that is it's racism. And I know that sometimes the language is key as well. We talk about racism and racial violence. Well, actually we're going on to the point where actually it's racial murder. And I think it's very important that we start by using the correct language, we challenge. And I think that's sometimes where media literacy, we've got to the stage where society's changed since 1984. You can't hide behind that veil of ignorance anymore and the veil of silence, because people want to engage, people want to support each other, and humanity and also protecting the earth where we live. It's all become very at the top of individuals' agenda.
So, starting from the first thing you said there, Narinder, I think that you were also saying that, in a way, the things that social work has been at its best, I think, wanting to expose in terms of structural inequalities and racism and oppression, is now come into public view through these terrible things that are going on, through the inequalities that have been exposed through COVID, and through this terrible murder in America, and people recognizing that this is part of something systemic in, not only in that society, but then people saying in our own. And I just think social work has at points has said it wanted to shine a light on that and deal with it. I think the question then becomes how well we've dealt with it. But that's what I'm that there's sort of sense of something being exposed. And you said that you thought that maybe people might support social work more, because they recognise if social work engages with these inequalities, then maybe that will be a way in which people will engage more positively with what social work's all about, because they're now that aware of these inequalities as well. Does that?
Yeah, no, it totally does, Ruth, because we've had, social work profession and our identity has actually been eroded by the government over many years, and also by the media. And I think we've constantly tried to fight this battle on our own, and we know that with the public outrage and that support, our voice seems to be heard. And that's I think that's where I really hope that we can make huge steps.
And I was thinking, moving on really to this, the reason why particularly why I'm talking to you two, although I would always want to, is because you're working on the equality and diversity group. I was thinking about that language actually, and whether that, you know, that the notion that are we watering down what we're actually tackling, what we're needing to tackle here by using terms just like diversity and just like equality, when we're probably talking about oppression, we're talking about, or anti-oppression, we're talking about racism, we're talking about, you know, much harder, more true, in a sense, close to the bone descriptors of what we're talking about. So there's that. But the reason why we've got this group is to make changes in BASW as an institution, and to make BASW as an organisation properly inclusive, and I would say anti-oppressive and anti-racist, and to have ways in for people, because if you don't, you know, how do institutions change? You know, they get made to change, or you try and make them more open and accessible. So I guess I was wondering what you're hoping from the Equality and Diversity Group, maybe say just a little bit about it, and what you're hoping we might achieve, not just the group itself, but obviously it's informing BASW. What should we be wanting? What should we see in 12 or 24 months' time that will say we've made a difference to the BASW as an organisation on these matters?
I think.
Okay.
Sorry, go on.
Okay, yeah, go ahead, Narinder.
I'm only going to. For me, it's about having a safe, brave space for our members to come and actually share their views openly. Because let's face it, I mean, I've self-reflected on this since all the awful things that are happening in the world today. And I think that when you start to look at yourself in the position, and then you start to look at other people, you realise that actually there's a lot bottled up internally there. And we need to recognise that we need to give people and our members and our supporters that safe space to actually not have that bottled up, and let's make some changes. BASW's always been about, it's a very innovative organisation, there's great leadership, and it's about really we tackle some of the really sticky circumstances, situations, topics, issues that other people don't really want to talk about. So for me, we're really at the early stages, and it's about giving people that safe space to actually, right, let's talk about this, and let's really get to the deep-rooted issues, and let's get to know each other, and let's start to find the commonalities, let's start to think about what's really going on, and it is going to get bigger, which I'm really glad to say, because there's so much to do really with it from having these discussions. Harry?
Yeah, sure. No, thanks. I mean, one of the kind of things, so to put it into context, the council, the trustees, the council at BASW have asked for this advisory group. And I guess a hint is in the title. It's not a steering group, it's not a committee, it's a group that really is going to be an advisory body to the council. And I think that's really important, because it's about the leadership of BASW saying it's our job to own and lead this, but we recognise that we need to, you know, maximise on all the talents, and yeah, just noting that an extension of maximising all the talents is about precisely what you've been saying, Narinder, around, you know, being inclusive in an approach. That this isn't about people at the so-called top of an organisation saying, okay, you know, what is it we need to do, but to kind of harness people's perspectives, people's intelligences, you know, people's skills even in shaping what the future might look like. So I think that's kind of the big thing, and I've been saying that consistently about engagement needs to be at the heart of the work of the advisory group. In terms of what things might look like in 12 or 24 months, it would be great for there to be something that really communicates to the membership in BASW and to the sector that BASW is taking this seriously, and that there's evidence of that. And evidence of that might be some of the inclusion. It might be about speaking about injustice and to find ways to name the injustice. And it was kind of great to hear Ruth just now saying, or maybe when we talk about equality and diversity and inclusion, it masks over the idea of oppression, because I immediately thought, yeah, there will be people who will argue, well, are we really seeing oppression? Who's oppressing who? That actually, you know, most people in social work and social care aren't oppressing anyone. And to create spaces where we have those conversations might be one of the kind of first stages of saying, let's actually start to debate what's really going on. Because so far, we've been trying to avoid it. We've been avoiding it by talking about unconscious bias and not talking about institutional racism or institutional discrimination. We've been kind of talking about individual issues and not really talking about some of the intersections. You know, how do we deal with you know, people from a faith background who might have views around same-sex relationships in our workforce and in our sector that we haven't really kind of gotten beneath. There's kind of a whole lot of material that we really need to kind of foreground and shine a light on. So that's kind of one stage. And then what would be really great to see is within the sector, our frontline workers feeling empowered to bring all of themselves, where they don't feel that what they say around the inequalities and discrimination that they face will not be validated, that people will try and explain it away through other mechanisms. And finally, and it's almost like not even answering the question, but kind of full circling in it, is to kind of come back to the inequalities around COVID-19, and for us to not be drawn in, and I'm using this as an example, into kind of thinking, oh, maybe there's something intrinsic about being from a racialized minority background that means we're more likely to deal with these problems, or that there's something culturally that means that we're more likely to face these inequalities, but to kind of start to name precisely the factors that are driving some of these, that actually there's kind of global systems around trade, around the way in which the environment is exploited. That means certain groups of people on this planet are likely to suffer more than others. We kind of think about what happens in urban areas and think about kind of poor people and people from racialized backgrounds who live in cities where there's going to be kind of, you know, high pollution rates and a link with death. And you talk about environmental racism or environmental inequality. Those things, I think, we can start to kind of foreground and say, yeah, we'll continue to work with people in crisis, but we're not going to stop talking about the patterns. They're not individual cases that present themselves. There is a pattern to it. And I think that, you know, in 24 months' time, we'll be more robust in taking that to politicians and other decision makers to say, yeah, we can't turn a blind eye to this because we become complicit in that. And we need to see these injustices tackled. And it isn't just a UK challenge, it's a global one.
Thank you. Thank you, Harry. Thank you, Narinder. It's been fantastic that you've joined me today. Thank you very much for the work that you're doing and the fact that you're on council, as well as convening the Equalities and Diversity Group, as it is currently named. It might be getting some other names based on that last bit of conversation. Really, really powerful messages there, and a lot of reason to be, I think, very encouraged to know that you are working within and with BASW to make these changes, which we know we absolutely need to make. And I do believe there's a huge amount of motivation within the association for that. And the fact that so many people have come forward to get involved with the advisory group, and happen to know there's more coming forward, there's even more names to be sent. And we do encourage, obviously, members to get involved. And it might not be just about getting involved with like an advisory group, but it's about other ways in which we will engage with, provide opportunities for our members from all sorts of different communities and backgrounds to get involved. And that will evolve and grow over time with different opportunities. I mean, obviously, we've been talking particularly today about Black and racialized groups in the context of COVID, in the context of the George Floyd murder and the protests and the awareness raising that's happening around that and the anger. The group is also thinking about all sorts of aspects of diversity and inclusion and oppression. So thinking about members who might be disabled, issues around sexuality and other kinds of marginalisation that people might experience. So it's about that as well. But thank you so much for joining me today to talk about these topics with great passion, and thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you both.